Jake Morrison pulled his black hat low over his eyes as he rode into the dusty town of Cedar Ridge. His horse's hooves clicked against the wooden planks of the main street, creating a rhythm that matched his steady heartbeat. The sun was setting, behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the buildings that lined both sides of the road. He had been riding for 3 days straight, following the instructions in the letter that now sat folded in his vest pocket. The paper was worn from being read so many times, but the words were burned into his memory. Kill Sarah Martinez. Payment, $5,000. Location, Cedar Ridge General Store. No questions asked. Jake had been in this business for 15 years. He was known throughout the territory as a man who got the job done quickly and quietly. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, and people either feared him or respected him from a distance. He never took jobs that involved children or innocent folks, but the letter assured him that Sarah Martinez was neither, according to his employer. Sarah was a dangerous woman who had stolen money from several banks across 3 states. She was hiding in Cedar Ridge under a false identity, running the general store while planning her next heist. The authorities couldn't touch her because she was too smart, too careful. That's where Jake came in, as he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the saloon. Jake noticed how peaceful the town seemed. Children played in the dirt streets while their mothers hung laundry on lines stretched between buildings. Old men sat on porches, smoking pipes and watching the world go by. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where folks looked out for each other. Jake pushed through the saloon doors and ordered a whiskey. The bartender, a heavy-set man with graying hair, poured the drink without asking any questions. Jake had learned long ago that saloon keepers in small towns usually minded their own business, especially when it came to strangers who looked like trouble. He listened to the conversations around him, picking up bits of information about the townspeople. A group of cowboys at a corner table talked about the upcoming cattle drive. 2 women near the window discussed plans for the church social, but it was the conversation between 2 merchants that caught his attention. They were talking about Sarah Martinez and how she had helped the widow Thompson pay for her husband's funeral when she couldn't afford it. They mentioned how Sarah often gave credit to families who were struggling to make ends meet, never pressing them for payment when times were hard. One of the men said she was the kindest person in Cedar Ridge, always willing to help anyone who needed it. Jake frowned as he finished his whiskey. This didn't match the description in his letter at all. But he had learned not to trust local gossip. People in small towns often saw what they wanted to see, especially when it came to someone they liked. Sarah Martinez could be playing a role, waiting for the right moment to disappear with whatever money she had stolen. He left the saloon and walked down the street toward the general store. Through the large front window, he could see a woman moving around inside, arranging items on shelves and helping a customer. She had long dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and she wore a blue dress that looked practical rather than fancy. Jake watched her for several minutes, studying her movements and trying to get a sense of who she was. She seemed genuine, as she helped the customer find what he needed, even walking him to the door and waving goodbye as he left. But Jake knew that appearances could be deceiving. He had met plenty of criminals who could charm their way out of any situation. The next morning, Jake positioned himself across the street from the general store, pretending to read a newspaper while keeping an eye on Sarah's activities. He watched as she opened the store right on time, sweeping the front steps and adjusting the sign in the window. Throughout the day, a steady stream of customers came and went. What struck Jake was how Sarah interacted with each person. She remembered their names, asked about their families, and seemed genuinely interested in their lives. When a young mother came in with 3 small children, Sarah gave each child a piece of candy while their mother shopped. When an elderly man struggled to carry his purchases, Sarah walked outside to help him load everything into his wagon. Jake had been watching criminals for years, and he knew the difference between someone putting on an act and someone who was genuinely caring. Sarah Martinez didn't seem to be pretending. Every gesture, every smile, every kind word appeared to come from a place of real compassion. As the day wore on, Jake began to question the information in his letter. Either Sarah Martinez was the best actress he had ever encountered, or someone had made a serious mistake. But Jake Morrison didn't make mistakes. He was careful, professional, and thorough. He always verified his information before taking action. That evening, he decided to visit the store just before closing time. He needed to get closer to Sarah to look her in the eyes and see what kind of person she really was. As he pushed open the door, a small bell chimed overhead, and Sarah looked up from behind the counter with a warm smile. She was even more beautiful up close. With kind brown eyes and a face that seemed incapable of deception, when she spoke, her voice was soft and welcoming. With just a hint of a Spanish accent that made her words sound like music, Jake pretended to browse the shelves while stealing glances at Sarah. She went about her work quietly, counting the money in the register and making notes in a ledger. Everything about her seemed normal, ordinary, innocent. For the first time in his career, Jake Morrison began to wonder if he had been hired to kill the wrong person. Jake spent the next few days observing Sarah from different angles, trying to find any crack in what seemed to be a perfect facade of innocence. He watched her from the hotel window, from the bench outside the barber shop, and from various positions. Along the main street, each day only reinforced his growing doubt about the job he had been hired to do. On Thursday morning, Jake witnessed something that shook him to his core. A family of travelers had stopped in Cedar Ridge, their wagon broken down and their money running low. The father, a thin man with desperate eyes, came into Sarah's store with his young daughter, hoping to buy enough food to last them until they could repair their wagon and move. Jake watched through the window as the man counted out a handful of coins, clearly not enough to buy what his family needed. Sarah listened patiently as he explained their situation, his voice barely audible through the glass. Then something remarkable happened. Sarah began packing supplies into a large sack, far more than the man's money could buy. When the father protested, Sarah simply smiled and said something that made the man's eyes fill with tears. She refused to take any payment at all, insisting that the family take the supplies as a gift. As the grateful father left the store with enough food to feed his family for a week, Jake saw Sarah wipe a tear from her own cheek. This was not the behavior of a hardened criminal. This was the action of someone with a heart full of compassion, someone who put the needs of others before her own profit. Jake felt a strange sensation in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. It took him a moment to recognize it as doubt about his mission. That afternoon, Jake decided to enter the store again, this time engaging Sarah in conversation. He needed to hear her voice, to look into her eyes, and to judge for himself what kind of person she truly was. He picked up a few items from the shelves and approached the counter where Sarah stood sorting through a box of new merchandise. When she looked up at him, Jake felt something unexpected happen. Her smile was so genuine, so warm, that it caught him completely off guard. For a moment, he forgot why he was there, forgot about the letter in his pocket, forgot about the $5,000 waiting for him when the job was done. Sarah asked if she could help him find anything else, and Jake found himself making small talk about the weather and the town. Her responses were natural and unguarded, without any of the careful calculation he would expect from someone living under a false identity. She talked about Cedar Ridge as if it were her true home, mentioning plans for the future and her hopes for the community. As their conversation continued, Jake learned that Sarah had lived in Cedar Ridge for 2 years. She had arrived with very little money, but had worked hard to build up the general store, earning the trust and respect of everyone in town. She talked about her customers as if they were family, knowing details about their lives that went far beyond business relationships. When a young boy ran into the store, clearly upset about something, Sarah immediately stopped what she was doing to comfort him. The child had lost his lunch money on the way to school and was afraid to tell his parents. Without hesitation, Sarah gave him a sandwich from behind the counter and enough money to buy milk from the school. Jake watched this interaction with growing amazement. There was nothing calculated about Sarah's kindness. It flowed from her as naturally as water from a spring. The boy hugged her tightly before running back to school, and Sarah returned to helping Jake as if nothing unusual had happened. As Jake left the store that day, he carried more than just his purchases. He carried a growing certainty that he had been given false information about Sarah Martinez. But this created a new problem. Jake Morrison had never failed to complete a job once he accepted it. His reputation depended on reliability and results. That evening, Jake sat in his hotel room and carefully read the letter again, looking for any clues about who had hired him. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and the signature was just an initial. The return address led to a post office box in Denver, which told him nothing useful. Jake had always operated on a strict policy of not asking questions about his employers or their motives. He took the job, completed it efficiently, collected his payment, and moved on. But this situation was different. For the first time in his career, he was beginning to care about the person he had been hired to kill. The next day brought an event that would change everything. Jake was having breakfast in the hotel dining room when he heard shouting from the street. He rushed outside to see smoke pouring from the roof of the schoolhouse. A fire had started in the building, and children were still inside. Without thinking about the danger, Sarah Martinez ran toward the burning building. Jake watched in horror as she disappeared through the smoke-filled doorway. Other townspeople formed a bucket line, trying to control the flames, but Sarah was inside the school. Helping the teacher get the last few children to safety, Jake found himself running toward the fire as well, his heart pounding with fear for Sarah's safety. When she emerged from the building, carrying a small girl who had been too frightened to move, her dress was singed and her face was streaked with soot. But her eyes shone with determination and relief. The fire was eventually controlled, and thankfully, no one was seriously hurt. But Jake would never forget the image of Sarah risking her own life to save those children. As he watched the townspeople surround her with gratitude and praise, he realized that killing this woman would not just be wrong, it would be evil. That night, as Jake lay in his hotel bed staring at the ceiling, he made a decision that would change the course of his life. He could not kill Sarah Martinez. More than that, he needed to find out who wanted her dead and why. Someone had paid $5,000 to have an innocent woman murdered, and Jake Morrison was going to find out who. Jake's decision to protect Sarah instead of kill her brought a mix of relief and anxiety. He had never gone against a contract before, and he knew there would be consequences. But as he watched Sarah tend to the minor burns on her hands from the fire rescued, he knew he had made the right choice. The problem was that Jake didn't know how much time he had before his employer expected results. The letter hadn't specified a deadline, but Jake's reputation was built on quick, efficient work. Soon, someone would be expecting news of Sarah's death. And when that news didn't come, it might send someone else to finish the job. Jake decided he needed to get closer to Sarah, to understand her past, and figure out why someone wanted her dead. He began visiting the store more frequently, always finding excuses to make purchases or ask questions. Sarah seemed to enjoy their conversations, and Jake found himself looking forward to seeing her smile each day. During one of these visits, Jake carefully steered the conversation toward Sarah's past. He mentioned that she seemed too young to be running a business all by herself, wondering aloud if she had family somewhere who might visit. The question brought a shadow across Sarah's face, and for the first time, Jake saw sadness in her eyes. Sarah explained that she had no family left. Her parents had died when she was very young, and she had been raised by her uncle in Mexico. When he passed away 2 years ago, she had decided to start fresh in a new place. She had chosen Cedar Ridge because it reminded her of the small town where she had grown up, where people cared about each other and worked together, as Sarah talked about her past. Jake noticed that she was careful not to mention specific names or places. At first, this made him suspicious again, wondering if she was hiding something criminal after all. But then he realized that a young woman traveling alone would naturally be cautious about sharing too many details with strangers, even friendly. Once Jake also learned that Sarah's real name was indeed Sarah Martinez, which surprised him. Most people running from the law would use a completely false identity. Either she was incredibly bold, or she truly had nothing to hide. Given everything else he had observed about her character, Jake was leaning toward the latter explanation. As the days passed, Jake began to notice other things about Sarah that reinforced his belief in her innocence. She kept careful records of all her business transactions, never trying to hide money or goods. She paid her bills on time and dealt honestly with her suppliers. Most tellingly, she had never shown any interest in leaving Cedar Ridge, despite several opportunities. A traveling merchant had offered her a job in Santa Fe, would have paid much more than her store earned. A wealthy rancher had proposed marriage, which would have given her security and status. But Sarah had turned down both opportunities, saying that Cedar Ridge was her home and these people were her family now. Jake's growing certainty about Sarah's innocence was confirmed by an unexpected event. One morning, as he was having coffee, across the street from the store, he noticed a stranger watching Sarah's building with the same intensity that Jake had once shown. The man was dressed like a drifter, but something about his posture and alertness suggested he was more than he appeared. Jake's instincts, honed by years of dangerous work, told him that this man represented a threat. He watched as the stranger circled the building, noting the exits and studying the daily routines of Sarah and her customers. This was exactly the kind of surveillance Jake himself would do before completing a job. The realization hit Jake like a physical blow. His employer had sent someone else to kill Sarah, either because Jake was taking too long or because they had somehow learned about his change of heart. Either way, Sarah was in immediate danger, and Jake was the only person who knew it. Jake spent the rest of the day shadowing the stranger, learning his patterns and trying to figure out when he planned to make his move. The man was good at his work, careful not to be seen by Sarah or the townspeople, but Jake was better. By evening, he had confirmed his worst fears. The stranger was definitely another hired killer. He was planning to act that very night. Jake overheard him asking the hotel clerk about the back exit from Sarah's building, claiming he was interested in renting the apartment above the store. The question was innocent enough on the surface, but Jake recognized the real purpose behind it. As darkness fell over Cedar Ridge, Jake positioned himself where he could watch both the front and back of Sarah's building. She was working late, doing inventory and preparing orders for the next day's deliveries. Through the windows, Jake could see her moving around inside, completely unaware of the danger lurking outside. Around midnight, Jake saw the stranger emerge. From the shadows behind the building, the man moved with practiced silence, picking the lock on the back door with tools that gleamed in the moonlight. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the gun on his hip, but he hesitated. If Jake intervened, now, he would have to kill the other assassin or risk being killed himself. Either way, his own secret would be exposed. Sarah would learn that he had originally come to Cedar Ridge to kill her, and she would never trust him again. The peaceful life he had begun to imagine for himself in this town would be impossible. But, as Jake watched the stranger slip inside the building where Sarah was working alone, he realized that his own future didn't matter. What mattered was protecting an innocent woman who had shown him what genuine goodness looked like. What mattered was proving to himself that Jake Morrison could be more than just a killer for hire. Jake drew his gun and moved silently toward the back door of Sarah's store. Inside, he could hear the soft sound of footsteps on the wooden floor, and he knew that Sarah's life was now measured in seconds. Whatever happened next, Jake Morrison was no longer the same man who had ridden into Cedar Ridge with murder in his heart. As he pushed open the door and stepped into the darkness of the store, Jake heard Sarah's voice call out in confusion, asking who was there. The sound of her voice, so trusting and unafraid, gave Jake the strength he needed to do what he had never done before: use his skills as a killer to save a life instead of taking one. Jake moved through the darkness of the store like a shadow, his years of experience guiding him around obstacles he couldn't see. He could hear the other assassin moving closer to where Sarah was working in the front room, and he knew he had only moments to act. The stranger had made one crucial mistake. He didn't know that Jake Morrison was in Cedar Ridge, much less that Jake had turned protector instead of predator. This gave Jake the element of surprise, perhaps the only advantage he would have in the confrontation that was about to unfold. Jake reached the doorway between the storage room and the main store, just as he heard Sarah gasp in fear. "Do that!" Gap in the door, he could see the stranger pointing a gun at Sarah, who stood frozen behind the counter with her account books scattered around her feet. The assassin was speaking in a low, threatening voice, demanding to know where Sarah had hidden the money she had stolen. His words confirmed Jake's growing suspicion that someone had deliberately given false information about Sarah's past. She wasn't a bank robber or a thief. She was being framed by someone who wanted her dead for entirely different reasons. Sarah's response was exactly what Jake expected from her. Even with a gun pointed at her heart, she spoke with dignity and courage, insisting that she had never stolen anything from anyone. She asked the man who had sent him and why they wanted to hurt her, but the assassin just laughed coldly. Jake couldn't wait any longer. He stepped into the room with his own gun drawn, speaking in the quiet, deadly voice that had intimidated countless men over the years. The stranger spun around, surprised by Jake's sudden appearance, and for a split second, both men stared at each other across the dimly lit store. Jake recognized the type immediately, a younger man. He's probably newer to the business, eager to prove himself by taking on jobs that more experienced killers might refuse. He had the nervous energy of someone who relied more on brutality than skill, which made him dangerous in an unpredictable way. The confrontation lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity to Jake. The stranger tried to turn his gun on Jake while keeping Sarah covered, an impossible task that left him vulnerable to Jake's superior experience. Jake's shot was clean and precise, dropping the assassin before he could harm Sarah or return fire. In the sudden silence that followed, Jake heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath. Daring, he turned to see her staring at him with wide eyes, taking in the scene of violence that had erupted in her peaceful store. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both trying to process what had just happened. Sarah was the first to find her voice, asking if Jake was hurt and thanking him for saving her life. But Jake could see the questions in her eyes, the realization that his presence in her store at midnight was more than just coincidence. She was beginning to understand that there was more to Jake Morrison than she had realized. Jake holstered his gun and moved to check on the fallen assassin, confirming that the threat was over. Then he turned back to Sarah, knowing that he owed her an explanation that would change everything between them. The moment he had been dreading had arrived. He would have to tell her the truth about why he had come to Cedar Ridge. But before Jake could speak, Sarah surprised him. She moved around the counter and placed her hand gently on his arm, her touch sending an unexpected warmth through him. She looked directly into his eyes and said that she had suspected for several days that he was more than just a passing traveler. Sarah explained that she had noticed how he watched people, how he carried himself, how his eyes never stopped moving. Even during casual conversation, she had recognized the signs of a man who had lived by violence. But she had also seen something else in him, kindness that he tried to hide beneath his tough exterior. Jake was stunned by her perceptiveness and her courage. Even knowing what he was, even having just witnessed him kill a man in her store, Sarah was not afraid of him. Instead, she seemed to understand that he had risked his own life to protect her. She was grateful for that protection. With the immediate danger past, Jake knew he had to tell Sarah everything. He explained about the letter, about the contract to kill her, about the money he had been offered to end her life. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, expecting to see fear or anger or disgust. But instead he saw only sadness and confusion. Sarah asked the question that had been haunting Jake since he first began watching her. Why would someone want her dead? She had lived a quiet life, hurting no one, helping everyone she could. The idea that someone hated her enough to hire a killer made no sense to her gentle nature. Jake had been thinking about this question for days, and he had developed a theory. Someone in Sarah's past, perhaps. Someone connected to her uncle. Or her family's property in Mexico had a reason to want her gone. It might be about inheritance, or land rights, or some other dispute that Sarah didn't even know existed as they talked. Jake found himself opening up to Sarah in a way he had never opened up to anyone before. He told her about his lonely life, about the jobs that had slowly eaten away at his soul, about the moment when he watched her rescue those children from the fire and realized he could never hurt her. Sarah listened without judgment, her dark eyes reflecting understanding and compassion. When Jake finished speaking, she did something that shocked him completely. She began to cry not from fear or anger, but from sadness for the life he had lived and gratitude for the choice he had made to protect her. those tears down her cheeks in the lamplight of her store, broke something inside Jake Morrison that had been frozen for years. For the first time since he was a boy, he felt the possibility of redemption, of becoming someone better than the man he had been. Jake reached out tentatively and wiped a tear from Sarah's cheek, marveling at the softness of her skin and the trust she showed by not pulling away from his touch. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of violence, but filled with the promise of something pure and good, Jake Morrison fell completely in love with the woman he had been hired to kill. The night of the shooting changed everything between Jake and Sarah, after they moved the body and cleaned up the evidence. Working together with a coordination that surprised them both, they sat in Sarah's kitchen above the store and talked until dawn. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he could be honest about who he was and what his life had been. Sarah listened to his stories without judgment, understanding that the man sitting across from her was not the same person who had done those terrible things. She could see the pain in his eyes when he talked about the lives he had taken, the loneliness he had endured, and the emptiness that had driven him from town to town with no real purpose except survival. In return, Sarah shared more about her own past than she had ever told anyone in Cedar Ridge. She spoke about her childhood in Mexico, about the uncle who had raised her after her parents died, and about the mysterious circumstances that had forced her to leave everything behind and start over in America. Jake's suspicions about Sarah being targeted for reasons beyond her control proved to be correct. Sarah's uncle had owned valuable land near a silver mine, and after his death, certain people had expected to claim that property through legal manipulations. Sarah's existence as the rightful heir complicated their plans, so they had decided to eliminate her permanently. The revelation explained everything: why the false information about Sarah being a bank robber, why someone was willing to pay $5,000 for her death, and why they had sent another killer when Jake failed to complete the job quickly. Sarah was not just innocent. She was the victim of greed and corruption that reached much further than Cedar Ridge. Jake realized that killing the second assassin had only bought them time. Whoever wanted Sarah dead would eventually send more men, and Jake couldn't protect her forever by himself. They needed to find a permanent solution, which meant confronting the people behind the conspiracy and proving Sarah's innocence once and for all. Over the next few days, Jake and Sarah worked together to uncover the truth about her uncle's property and the people who were trying to steal it. They sent letters to lawyers in Mexico, contacted officials who had known her family, and gathered evidence that would prove Sarah's legal right to her inheritance. During this time, Jake found himself changing in ways he had never imagined possible. Sarah's influence on him was profound and immediate. Her kindness softened his hard edges. Her faith in people's basic goodness challenged his cynical worldview. And her love for the community of Cedar Ridge made him want to belong somewhere for the first time in his adult life. Jake began helping Sarah in the store, learning the names of regular customers and discovering the satisfaction that came from honest work. He found himself caring about whether the widow Thompson had enough flour for the week, whether the school children had adequate supplies, and whether the traveling families had what they needed for their journeys. The townspeople were initially suspicious of Jake, sensing the danger that surrounded him even when he tried to hide it. But Sarah's acceptance of him gradually opened doors throughout Cedar Ridge. If Sarah Martinez trusted this mysterious stranger, then he must be worthy of that trust. Jake's transformation became complete when Sarah asked him to help her plan a community celebration for the harvest season. The idea of Jake Morrison, feared gunslinger and professional killer, organizing a church social was almost laughable. But Jake threw himself into the project with surprising enthusiasm. He helped Sarah coordinate food donations, organize games for the children, and even agreed to participate in a shooting contest that would demonstrate his skills for entertainment rather than violence. For the first time in his life, Jake was using his abilities to bring people together instead of tearing them apart. The harvest celebration was a tremendous success, and Jake found himself surrounded by grateful townspeople who treated him like a valued member of their community. Children who had once hidden behind their mothers when he passed now ran up to him with excited chatter about the games he had organized. But the perfect evening was interrupted by the arrival of 3 strangers who rode into town just as the celebration was reaching its peak. Jake recognized their type immediately professional gunman, better equipped and more experienced than the assassin he had killed in Sarah's store. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized that Sarah's enemies had finally sent killers who were worthy of their reputation. These men wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating their target or failing to account for Jake's presence. They had come prepared for a war, and they were willing to destroy anyone who got in their way. As the three strangers dismounted and began walking toward the celebration, Jake saw the fear in the townspeople's eyes. They might not understand exactly what was happening, but they could sense the violence that was approaching their peaceful gathering. Jake knew he had to act quickly to protect not just Sarah, but all the innocent people who had become his friends and neighbors. He also knew that this confrontation would likely be his last. The three gunmen were skilled enough to kill him, and even if he survived, his presence would continue to bring danger to Cedar Ridge. Sarah saw the resignation in Jake's eyes and immediately understood what he was thinking. She grabbed his arm and told him that they would face this threat together, that he didn't have to sacrifice himself to protect her and the town. Her words were brave, but Jake could see the tears forming in her eyes. Jake cupped Sarah's face in his hands and looked into her eyes one last time, memorizing every detail of her beautiful features. He told her that loving her had given his life meaning for the first time, that the weeks he had spent in Cedar Ridge had been worth more than all his previous years combined. Then Jake Morrison walked away from the woman he loved and toward the three men who had come to kill her. Knowing that his transformation from killer to protector was about to be tested in the most final way possible. Jake walked slowly toward the three gunmen, his hands relaxed at his sides but ready to draw at a moment's notice. The townspeople sensed the danger and began moving away from the center of the celebration. Parents gathering their children and elderly folks seeking shelter behind buildings. The leader of the three men was tall and lean, with cold gray eyes that reminded Jake of his own reflection from years past. He wore his guns with the casual confidence of someone who had never lost a fight, and his smile held no warmth as he called out Jake's name. Jake wasn't surprised that they knew who he was. His reputation had followed him to Cedar Ridge just as it had followed him everywhere else. What did surprise him was that the leader seemed more interested in recruiting him than killing him. The man introduced himself as Cole Watson and explained that their employer was willing to pay Jake double his original fee, not for killing Sarah, but for stepping aside and letting them complete the job. It was a generous offer, Watson said. Considering that Jake had already violated his contract by protecting his target, Jake's response was quiet but clear. He told Watson that Sarah Martinez was under his protection, and anyone who wanted to hurt her would have to go through him first. The words carried the weight of absolute commitment, and Watson's smile faded as he realized that negotiation was not going to be possible. Watson shrugged and spread his hands in a gesture of false regret, saying that Jake's reputation had clearly been exaggerated if he was willing to die for a woman he barely knew. Suggested that Jake was getting soft in his old age, letting sentiment cloud his professional judgment. Jake felt a moment of doubt as Watson's words echoed his own fears about the changes Sarah had brought to his life. But then he heard Sarah's voice calling his name from behind him, and he remembered why those changes were worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. The gunfight that followed was unlike any Jake had ever experienced. In previous confrontations, he had been motivated by money, survival, or professional pride. This time, he was fighting for love, for redemption, and for the chance to protect something pure and good in a world that had shown him mostly darkness. Jake's first shot took down one of Watson's companions before the man could clear leather. His second shot wounded the other gunman, sending him stumbling backward but not out of the fight. Watson himself proved to be as skilled as his reputation suggested. His bullet grazing Jake's shoulder and spinning him around, the battle moved through the main street of Cedar Ridge, with Jake using every bit of cover he could find while trading shots with the two remaining assassins. Windows shattered and wooden posts splintered as bullets flew back and forth. But Jake was grimly satisfied to note that the townspeople had found safety. Jake's experience and determination began to tell as the fight continued. The wounded gunman made a fatal mistake, exposing himself for a clear shot that Jake didn't miss. That left only Watson, who had taken position behind a water trough and was methodically trying to pin Jake down. Watson called out that this was Jake's last chance to walk away, that their employer was willing to let him live if he would. Just abandon Sarah and leave Cedar Ridge. Jake's answer was another carefully aimed shot that sent Watson diving for better cover. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but Sarah changed everything by walking out into the middle of the street. She ignored Jake's shouted warnings and Watson's threats. Moving with calm determination toward the man who had come to kill her, Sarah called out to Watson, offering to surrender herself if he would let Jake and the townspeople live. She said she was tired of running and hiding, tired of bringing danger to innocent people who had shown her nothing but kindness. If her death would end the violence, then she was willing to make that sacrifice. Jake felt his heart stop as he watched the woman he loved offer to die for his sake and the sake of their community. Watson stepped out from behind his cover, gun trained on Sarah, clearly tempted by the easy solution she was offering. But Jake Morrison had not spent weeks discovering his capacity for love and redemption, only to watch it be destroyed by his own past. He stepped into the open as well, placing himself between Watson and Sarah, his gun steady despite the blood flowing from his wounded shoulder. The three of them stood in a triangle of tension in the middle of Cedar Ridge's main street. Watson's gun was pointed at Sarah, Jake's gun was pointed at Watson, and for a moment, time seemed suspended as each person calculated their next move. Watson broke the silence by laughing, a harsh sound that echoed off the wooden buildings. He said that Jake's transformation from killer to hero was touching, but ultimately pointless. Even if Jake managed to kill him, more men would come. Sarah's enemies had deep pockets and long memories, and they would never stop hunting her. Jake knew that Watson was probably right about more killers coming, but he also knew that some fights were worth having regardless of the odds. He told Watson that Sarah Martinez was not going anywhere, and neither was he. Cedar Ridge was their home now. They would defend it against anyone who threatened their peace. Watson's expression grew serious as he realized that Jake meant every word. He had come to Cedar Ridge expecting to face the Jake Morrison of old, a man motivated by money and self-preservation. Instead, he was confronting someone who had found something worth dying for, which made him infinitely more dangerous. The final shots were fired almost simultaneously. Watson's bullet caught Jake in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the dusty street. But Jake's return shot was true, striking Watson in the heart and ending his threat forever. Sarah ran to Jake's side as he collapsed, cradling his head in her lap while calling for the town doctor. Blood was spreading across his shirt, and his breathing was shallow and labored. Jake looked up into Sarah's tear-filled eyes and managed to smile, telling her that he was glad he had lived long enough to love someone worth dying for. The doctor arrived quickly, along with half the population of Cedar Ridge, as they worked to stop Jake's bleeding and get him to the clinic. Sarah never left his side, whispering words of encouragement and love. The entire town seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if their unlikely hero would survive. Jake's recovery was slow but steady, aided by Sarah's constant care and the support of the community he had fought to protect. During the long days of healing, Sarah received word that her legal team in Mexico had successfully proven her ownership of her uncle's property and exposed the conspiracy against her. The men who had hired the assassins were arrested. Their illegal claims to Sarah's land were dismissed, and the threat to her life was finally ended. She was free to live openly and safely, no longer looking over her shoulder for danger that might never come. When Jake was finally strong enough to leave his bed, he found that Cedar Ridge had truly become his home. The townspeople who had once feared him now treated him as a hero. Children played games pretending to be as brave as Jake Morrison, and the local newspaper had written articles about his courage and sacrifice. But the greatest change was in Jake himself. The man who had once lived only for his next job, his next payment, his next escape from human connection, now woke each morning eager to help Sarah in the store, to participate in community events, and to build a future based on love rather than violence. 6 months after the gunfight that nearly claimed his life, Jake Morrison stood in the Cedar Ridge church wearing a clean white shirt and his best black suit. Sarah Martinez walked down the aisle toward him in a dress of ivory lace, her face radiant with happiness as the entire town watched their unlikely love story reach its perfect conclusion. As Jake took Sarah's hand and spoke the vows that would bind them together forever, he marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had come to Cedar Ridge as an instrument of death, hired to end Sarah's life. Instead, her tears, her kindness, and her unwavering faith in human goodness had given him a new life, a new purpose, and a love that would last forever. The man, who had once been Cedar Ridge's greatest threat, had become its most devoted protector, proving that even the darkest heart could be redeemed by the light of true love. Jake Morrison, the killer, was dead, replaced by Jake Morrison, the husband, the shopkeeper, and the man who had learned that the greatest victory was not in taking a life, but in choosing to save one.